You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is award-winning author Katherine J. Chen. Katherine's work has been published in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and Literary Hub, among others. Katherine is drawn to stories about powerful women, and her latest novel, Joan, a novel of Joan of Arc, is no exception. But this Joan is not the Joan you think you know. This is no meek martyr. Katherine's Joan is strong and powerful, filled with rage, prone to hubris, and shaped by a relationship to God that many have called controversial. From the moment I read this book months ago, I knew I needed to speak with its creator, and I am honored to have the chance to do that now. Please allow me to introduce Katherine J. Chen, author of Joan, a novel of Joan of Arc. Hello, Katherine. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for having me on your show.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Hi, everyone. My name is Katherine, and I like to think of myself as a relatively insignificant person who, it seems, likes to write about really significant people, such as Joan of Arc. It's generally pretty hard for me to call myself a writer, and I think this is probably true of any creative vocation where one's title, in my opinion, really has to be earned. So I feel I'm much more comfortable describing myself as a person who writes and who certainly takes writing very seriously, but to call myself a writer sometimes feels a step too far for some reason.
I think that's very humble of you because this book in particular is fantastic.
Well, I was thinking of the word writer the other day, and I thought immediately of that interview that Seamus Heaney did a long time ago. I think it was in the mid-90s, maybe 1995 or 1996, I think it was, with Charlie Rose. And I believe he described the noun of poet as a mighty one. And it was a word that is or should be considered sacred. And that part of the interview, for some reason, really stood out to me and stuck in my memory all these years and decades later. And I would agree with that, even though I'm obviously not a poet, but I feel the same way about the nouns like writer or artist. And to me, they carry a pretty heavy weight and probably shouldn't be used lightly.
So it's like a Platonic ideal that you're aspiring to.
Yes. Yes. That you're always working towards. It's a constant grind.
Can you tell us a little bit about who your inspiration was for your last book?
Oh, you mean for Mary B?
No, I mean for Joan of Arc.
Oh, let's see. Actually, that's a really good question because I feel in that case it was a situation where Joan chose me sort of as the subject versus like my picking her necessarily. I was listening to a really interesting interview the other day about the conversation was with a really extraordinary woman. She was an entrepreneur, a designer. I think she was an interior designer turned fashion designer, and overall just a really inspiring person. And the interview touched on many things. But one of the subjects that was discussed was animal rights, actually, in adopting a pet. And you may wonder how this ties into, writing a novel or choosing to write a novel on Joan of Arc. But one thing that I really loved that the interviewee said was that she said that the pet you think you choose to adopt actually chooses you. And it's not just you giving the pet a second chance at life or a chance at a better existence. It's also you taking responsibility for the pet, but the pet adding so much joy to your life and adding so much to your existence. And I think this is true with regard to, picking the subject matter for books as well. In retrospect and looking back, I felt I didn't choose this book so much as the book maybe chose me. I didn't choose Joan as much as she seemed to just materialize at the right place and at the right time. And, the story behind it is a relatively simple one, which is that one day I went into a bookstore. It was an impulse purchase where I was attracted by a book with a very shiny gold metallic cover. And it turned out to be a biography of Joan of Arc. And it was a total impulse purchase where I bought it without really, thinking about it because the cover was pretty. It was a relatively superficial reason to purchase a book. And I bought it, took it back home, forgot about it, didn't even read like the first, few pages or anything, just left it on the bookshelf. And then a couple years later, I found myself jobless, and because I was jobless, without health insurance, and really not sure like what the future held for me. I felt pretty adrift and without any concrete sense of direction. And so I basically needed another project, and I had another individual in mind to write about, actually, and I was pretty set to write about that other individual. But then when I looked over my bookshelf again, I came across that biography of Joan of Arc. And there was just something about seeing that book at that time when I pretty much like hit rock bottom, financially and everything else, that inspired me to pick up the book and start reading about her life. And I didn't make any, promises to myself that I would actually write about her because it seemed to be such a tall order. I already knew that, hundreds and thousands of books existed about her, but I thought, I would give myself a chance to investigate her life, her timeline, and see if there was anything new that I could add to the space of literature that already exists on her.
Wow. Okay, well, I want to explore that more, but before we get into that, can you tell us, do you have a connection yourself to France?
I wouldn't describe myself as a Francophile. To be totally honest, I'm probably more of an Anglophile than a Francophile, but it's more, I picked Joan of Arc, I hate to say this, not through any, lifelong love of France or wanting to visit there or go there, but simply because of what she represents. And she's become, to me, and I think for many people, an icon of truly, international and global reach. She has become like so much more than herself. And so, other than, definitely a respect for the culture and an increasing respect for the history and culture through the research I conducted for this book, I don't have any personal connection to France. I can't think of one. I have a very morbid sort of like little anecdote to share, which is maybe like slightly French connected, which is that the desktop wallpaper on my computer in which I write is the last words of Vincent van Gogh. And I believe he spoke his last words in French. And you would be able to say those words much better than I would. So I'm just going to say it in English. But he said the sadness lasts forever. But I believe he pronounced it in French, and he died in France. The sadness will last forever. That's just an angsty quote that I have on my desktop wallpaper.
It is a morbid desktop quote.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. But I've just like left it there, and somehow it works. So that's my maybe like not really French connection, but apparently he spoke those last words in French, and he died I believe in France. So
yes.
So there's my French connection.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. So let's dive into the questions. So I hesitate to mention this, and maybe normally I wouldn't, but I personally have never been particularly drawn to Joan of Arc. I don't have the same affinity for her that you have had. And so before I opened this book, I was not really expecting to be drawn in, and I certainly wasn't expecting to love this book the way that I did. And all of that is really down to your perspective, your writing and your perspective. And it starts with the opening scene, which is this, like, I guess, mock battle between two neighboring French towns with little kids, but they're throwing actual stones at each other. And this opening scene was so impactful for me. Can you talk about why you decided to start this book this way?
Well, I wanted to start the book with a scene that would serve as a kind of through line, kind of thread for the rest of the novel. So you have that mock battle, which, really doesn't turn out to be a mock battle in the end. There's unfortunately a casualty, and it turns out to be very real. And I wanted to use a very as vivid as possible a means of showing the consequences of the war, the daily, ramifications of the war in daily life. So Joan lives in, the village of Domremy, and it's true, like, this was mentioned, I believe, in the trial records, where she talked about how she would see boys returning from these rock fights, and they would actually be, bruised and, I think, a bit cut up. So they were actual fights with the neighboring village of Maxey, which had a Burgundian alliance. So I thought that was a great way to begin the book, and also capture not only a personal element, but also a political element as well, which is hard in historical fiction. It's hard to explore those political alliances and that history and that context without resorting to too much exposition. So I think that was the impetus for beginning with that scene. And then later, when she actually goes to battle, she thinks of that scene again. And it's almost like she's reliving that scene yet again, except she's more grown up now. And it's still like the boys fighting, but it's actual men. And of course, there are many more casualties. And I wanted to also create a parallel between the French boy, Guillaume, who dies at the very beginning of the book. I don't think that's much of a spoiler because it happens at the very beginning, with the English soldier named William that Joan basically holds as he dies. And that is, something that I gleaned from actually reading her history, that she did basically accompany an English soldier, like hold him as he died. And this was at Patay, the Battle Patay, I believe. So I wanted to show, the human loss on both sides, which is there's this innocent child named Guillaume on the French side who, is just, who knows what happened. He might have tripped and fell. He might have been bashed in the head with a rock, and his death was totally unexpected. And then there's this English soldier named William, who Joan also watches die. And she does show him a certain amount of mercy, and that causes a great deal of internal conflict within her as well.
Yeah, it shows some of her humanity too, because it's easy to empathize with a child who's died, or I suppose the family of the child who's died, but someone on a battlefield can often become inhuman in our minds during a battle. So I liked that you did that. It anchored it in human emotion and sentiment.
Yes, I totally agree. And she's so driven by rage.
Yes.
For so much of the book. And I think the rage element is quite important, actually, but that's a sobering moment for her when she actually pauses and shakes off this, I don't want to call it, warmongering, and I don't want to call it like a kind of bloodlust, because I don't think that's what it is. When she shakes that off and actually sees, person to person, like face to face, there's this young man dying in your arms. It's quite a different feeling.
Does French culture sometimes leave you scratching your head? Well, you might enjoy listening to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, hosted by journalist Emily Monaco. Each episode focuses on a different word in the French language, and Emily is joined by an expert who will help explore what that word says about French culture. Listen now to Navigating the French on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. A lot of this book is about Joan's childhood and really us learning about the fundamentals of how she was shaped into who she is. And it was like diametrically opposed to what I would have imagined for her childhood. Can you talk a little bit about the research that you were able to do about this part of her life?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's a fact that there exist a lot of books about Joan already, hundreds, I think thousands. And to be frank, there probably would not be much of a point to write another book about Joan of Arc if you're just going to approach this larger than life, almost mythical. And I say mythical just in terms of level of fame and global reach and endurance over time. Obviously not mythical in terms of existence. Of course she did exist. So, I mean, what happened was I wrote the first draft of the novel when I was, when I needed this project, and it was a big novel. It was written over a period of about half a year, and it turned out to be, I think, approximately 200,000 words or so.
Wow.
And that novel, so that version of the novel remained as faithful as I think it could possibly be to Joan's history and to the general timeline of her life. And it was, and I'm truly not being disingenuous in saying this, but it was just not a good novel. It just didn't work. And what I realized in writing this first draft, which was totally a necessary experience, is that I could make Joan the most human character possible, and I could make her, relatively relatable and sympathetic for 50, 100, 150, however many number of pages. But I felt that as soon as she begins to see the saints and to experience like literal visions of, seeing an ethereal being or heavenly being in front of you, it totally changes the landscape and the tone of the book. It will change the way a contemporary reader probably would feel about her. It will change the way you see her. And the way I think of it is that she will almost become like a kind of kite, if you know what I mean. Like you're technically still tethered to her, you're holding onto the string, but now the kite is floating somewhere over your head, and you have to look up in order to see her and watch her. And I didn't want her to become like this idol or this icon. The other pitfall for me, and I would offer that this may be true for other individuals of great renown who have written about Joan in the past, such as Mark Twain and Bernard Shaw, and goodness knows there have been many very famous authors who have tackled her, is that it's very easy to idolize Joan of Arc. And you almost want her to be that kite because it's easy to worship an idol, an icon, or like, a statue of marble. It's easier to see her as that icon than a person who lived and died at 19 years old. And she's a beloved saint after all. But I think when you want to actually write about such an individual, and your objective is to make her alive on the page, then that's a different ballgame entirely, in my opinion. You can't really put her on the pedestal anymore. You have to almost like coax her down from the plinth, as it were, and have her look at you, like really look at you, like look into your face, like eye to eye, and take over. And this is something that I feel pretty strongly about, which is I believe that imagination must ultimately reign in a novel, and I would not call myself a historian or a medieval scholar or a scholar of Joan of Arc's life. I've never professed to be a subject matter expert on the 100 Years' War. I'm just someone who needed to write about Joan at the time that I did. So what ended up happening was I rewrote the novel from scratch. I threw out the 200,000 words of that initial version, like right out the window, and started again. And it was necessary to do that. It was essential to do that because time had passed, and also I think if you give something time enough to incubate, you begin to think of different ways that certain things can materialize, such as the saints. The saints Catherine and Margaret, such as the Archangel Michael, and you start to think of how you can insert them and play with them in a different way, and how you can approach faith in a different way as well in the book.
I love that. That's a great answer. And it leads me very naturally into my next question, which is one of the things that I loved the most about this book was Joan's perspective on religion, because again, it's so different from the dogma that we've been fed and so far from this kite that you mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about her views on religion and why you decided to craft them that way?
Well, personally, I don't like the linearity of faith or the oversimplification of faith, which if you take Joan's history as is, and I think this is probably a slightly controversial thing to say and something that might annoy or irritate certain people, but if you take Joan's history as is, it is very much a story that seems to move from point A to point B. And the visions are basically the catalyst for everything. It's more or less the visions compelling her to take action, to listen to them, to heed them, to follow orders. That is like to leave her village behind and to undertake this huge task. And, for me, that's not, in my opinion, how heroes are necessarily made. I once read a line in a book review, and this might also be a slightly controversial thing for a historical fiction author to say, which is that history doesn't always make a great story. There has to, at least in novel form, where the reading experience is generally an extremely personal one, where it's just the reader and the book, or the reader and the audiobook, or whatever platform you're using to absorb the book. There has to be more of an impetus. There have to be more factors at play working together to explain the miracle of her legacy and of what she managed to accomplish in her life. And the thing is, I would actually disagree to an extent with descriptions of the book as being like a secular retelling. Because I'm not putting down the importance of faith. I think actually spirituality and belief in God run deep in the work, and I think God's presence is very much in the book. I believe God is there, always there, and he's watching Joan, guiding her, and he never gives up on her. And the Joan of this novel, I believe, believes in God because she bargains with him. She tries to form a pact with God. And I think it's natural for her, like any human being, especially a human being under immense pressure, to doubt and to despair. I think doubt goes hand in hand with, belief in a way. And one of my favorite scenes in the book is when she exits the forest and she looks behind her and she sees the stag. And the stag is obviously a symbol of religious importance. I love the story of Saint Hubertus so much. And the stag is watching Joan when she leaves behind the darkness of the forest. And I meant that as a way to show that God is watching and he is making sure she is safe. And the thing is, I'm not going to hit readers over the head with visions and saints, because in a novel, you have to give, creative space for the reader to think and to consider. And you have to, as I mentioned, let imagination, take the reins. And the result is that I'm going to incorporate the visions and the saints in a different way. So, for instance, I'm going to blur the lines between St. Catherine of Alexandria and Catherine, Joan's very saint-like sister, who I think is the one character in the book with probably the purest heart and the most self-sacrificing heart. She's just a genuinely good person and almost an angelic person. And I'm going to make Joan think of Saint Margaret of Antioch when Joan is leaving her village. So that's like how Margaret is going to appear. And there's also that scene where I believe the statue of Margaret laughs, or she hears the statue of Margaret laughing when she knocks a boy down with a punch. And, I'm going to liken Joan's departure from Domremy, her village, with Margaret emerging from Satan's body. That moment of liberation, of taking a breath of fresh air, of starting your life over again. And, these are all creative choices, such as like putting the stamp of the Archangel Michael on the Dauphin's first gift to Joan. These are all creative choices that not everyone is going to agree with. But they are choices that I hope, and one can only hope, make people think of Joan in a different way.
Yeah, very interesting. You said that there's been a controversial reaction to the religious aspect. Has it been in terms of this non-secularity or secularity?
Yes. So I don't pay too much attention for the sake of my own mental health. That's why I'm not on social media. Because for every like nice comment there's something else lying in wait. And I don't watch The Voice generally, but, the singing show, The Voice.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the United States, Gwen Stefani has been invited back as a judge again. And I remember her saying that, this is kind of a tangent, but she was saying that, back in the day, she and her band, no doubt, they would have to like go pick up fan mail and like, read all these nice things. And then there would be that one letter that, was more critical and negative. And that's the only thing that they would remember, like the negative thing. And I think that's just true of human nature. Like you hold on to the negative thing and you forget all the other nice things. So that's why I stay off of social media, because I'm too much of a wimp. um, so yeah, I think there has been some amount of discussion about the liberties I've taken with Joan's history and her life, and particularly the way I portray, her faith and religion. But, it bothers me a little when I hear about, spirituality missing from the book, or that the book feels like too secular, because I really don't think that's true. And, I don't want to, as I mentioned, I don't want to hit the reader over the head with, these literal visions, but I think there's enough of a divine presence that I feel should be, relatively apparent. And also, I have too much respect also for the reader's intelligence to doubt that if they really wanted to read about Joan of Arc's history, that they couldn't just go to the library or a bookstore and read a biography. And they would be spoiled for choice in terms of just the range and the expertise and the skill of the various biographies and histories available. And I would personally feel very happy if after reading the novel, the reader felt interested enough in learning more about Joan and decided to read a biography of Joan of Arc. That would make me very happy. And I don't think reading the biography or knowing Joan's history necessarily has to negate the novel. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. This book is told from such a clear perspective. Like I always knew and Joan always knew very strongly what she was thinking. I felt like I was living inside her brain. How did you get yourself into her mindset?
It took a lot of time, and I think I managed that only in rewriting the book, because in between the first draft of the novel and then rewriting from scratch, I was diagnosed with cancer, and I went through, cancer treatment is never like a one-day thing, so it's quite prolonged, no matter what type of cancer you have, I think. And it takes both a physical toll and emotional toll on you and the people around you. And so I think it was that experience with illness, which obviously, I'm here, it didn't kill me or anything like that. And it was never a terminal thing. I don't want to exaggerate the severity of the illness, but I think it was that interaction or experience with being sick, and also the shock of discovering that I had cancer at the time, that made me realize the preciousness of time, which is obviously essential if you're writing a book on Joan of Arc, which is, she died when she was only 19 years old. And so I think if you take away anything from her life and from the lessons that we should try to learn from history, there's no better reminder of kind of the preciousness of time. And I think for me, she's emblematic of how to live a truly meaningful life, of living a life that feels, both honest to yourself and fulfilling your destiny, your purpose, even when it means, dying at a very young age or dying before one's time. And all of these qualities, I think, we can find in Joan. And I sort of had a better understanding of, I don't want to sound cheesy, but the preciousness of time and of life after my brush with illness.
I can see that. I'm sorry to hear about the illness, of course. I think there's something in the writing that makes Joan feel like a personal heroine instead of like this big, like you said, mythical, martyred creature. She feels like a real person that I, in the end, could really relate to as well. And I could look to her as my own personal heroine, as someone that I could, I don't know, take some sort of aspiration from.
Yeah, yes. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the interview that I listened to, where, the really inspiring lady talked about adopting a pet and animal rights and how the pet also chooses you. It's, essentially what happened was because I had changed from the illness, my experience with illness, and just from, the passage of time itself. The character of Joan changed with me. So my experiences changed her character, and her experiences, her life story also changed me in turn. And in rewriting the novel, I was also compelled to remember that Joan, she was canonized in 1920, so almost 500 years after her death. But she was obviously once a person. She's not, like a goddess, like a mythical goddess. She was once a person. She was a living, breathing, flesh and blood individual. And we have to remember that she was a child, a girl who became a young woman, and she never had the chance to grow out of her teens. And she's much more complex, I think, than how, some would prefer to remember her. She had a temper, she was proud, she had a quick tongue, she was very good with a retort when the opportunity called for one. She was clearly very intelligent, very capable, a natural leader, and a fast learner with inherent abilities. And that's what inspired sort of the God-given talent or gifts that the character of Joan in the novel has. And we also have to remember, too, that, even though it's common enough to call her a martyr, she was afraid of the fire, and she didn't want to die. And one thing that I came across that I read, which really moved me quite a lot, was I read that she had wept when she saw the place at which she would be burned. So when she saw the platform, the pyre, she began to weep. And that's, when we think of martyrs, I think generally we think of a kind of stoicism or almost a kind of willingness to go to one's death. But her death was purposely prolonged to make the suffering as terrible as possible. And she didn't want to die. She wanted to live. And so I wanted to capture the human Joan. I didn't want to write about the beatified and the canonized Joan from, 500 years later, when it was, basically, I don't want to say convenient for the church to make her a saint, but, that was kind of the case. And I think that's the thing with historical fiction as well. We tend to view it as such a lofty genre because so often it seems to deal with, or it seems to concern itself with, the lives of heroes, of, monarchs, of statesmen, of people who are worthy or noteworthy enough to be recorded in the annals of history. But we have to remember, too, that these people, however elevated and admired they are, they're just regular people at the end of the day. They're people who's, and I learned this from reading, the books of one of my literary idols, but, they're people whose eyes water, whose noses leak in cold weather, who sneeze and who laugh and snort and cry. And you have to remember that she was just a girl. And it's amazing when you look at the timeline of her life. It's really so end heavy. And by that, I mean just like the last. So basically, I think she met the Dauphin in 1429. So I think it was in March of 1429. And then she lifted the siege at Orleans in early May of the same year. And by September 8th, which is like a holy day, she tried to take Paris, and she was obviously failed. And so her career was very short. And we have to remember that as well, that her military career was short. She spent a lot of time, more time, I think, in prison and on trial than actually experiencing victories on the battlefield.
Have you always dreamed of owning a place in Paris? If you're planning on moving, renting, buying, or selling a place in France, you'll need the expert guidance of Gail Boisclair and Marytr, hosts of the Paris Estate of Mind podcast. Listen now to Paris Estate of Mind on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris.
Well, I think it would be wonderful if we could hear a little bit from this book.
Oh, okay.
Is there anything that we need to know contextually before you read to us?
Well, thankfully, I think you provided some of the context, Jennifer, when you mentioned the fight with the boys from the neighboring village of Maxey. So basically, the beginning scene of the novel is the boys from Domremy, which is Joan's village, and they're allied with the French, are engaging in this rock fight with the so-called enemy boys from a neighboring village of Maxey, which is allied with Burgundy. And what happens is there's a unfortunate casualty where a boy named Guillaume dies, and Guillaume is from Joan's village. So this is sort of the aftermath of Guillaume's death and the impact of that death on Joan's village. So I'll begin reading. But death is not the end. There is the matter of reparation, of costing out the total price of his family's loss against his value, both real and projected, the man Guillaume would have become, the labor he would have performed, the wife he would have married, the children he would have had, the litter of cats he would have raised. She imagines each limb of the boy being measured, each hand and foot weighed, his naked body now washed and clean, searched for disfigurements or scars. She sees with her mind's eye numbers being scratched across a vellum scroll, then added, several calculations checked and cross-checked. The result may be something like this. For each ankle, 2 chickens, each thigh, a pig. For his arms, which when grown would have worked his family's land, an ox. For his head and his heart, a horse of good age and a shiny new plow. But how is love weighed? She has heard Guillaume was born late to his parents, and there is a difference of 7 years between his elder sister and the son they wished for. From her pocket she pulls out the smooth rock and runs her thumb along the edge. It is so dark she cannot see her own hand, but the rock is there. She feels it, how light it is in her palm. What has happened makes her sad. Not for the first time today, she is in danger of crying when she thinks how what is warm and good isn't enough to save a boy's life. Not a father's protection or a mother's tenderness, but beatings, a body hardened to pain, the ease with which one rolls a stick like a club into one's hand and is willing to hurt another, might. Love possibly isn't enough either. Not in this world where nearly all the stories she hears from her uncle are about wars both past and present. Who has lost? Who has won? Who is maimed and how many are dead? She makes a promise, whispers it into the dark, imprinting it in the night sky as the boy's face is imprinted in her memory. The promise is this. If she, Joan, has a choice, then she will choose to be a thrower of rocks. She will live.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer.
So what's next for you? Do you have another book in the works?
I do, and I'm procrastinating. And I have no idea how I'm going to write it because I don't know why I choose these people or these characters that are all like so like giants and all like so larger than life and so difficult to write about, but I guess I'm just naturally drawn to them. Thus what I said in the beginning when I was introducing myself about writing about significant people, but I'm making a foray, I think, into Arthurian literature, and I hope to write about Morgan Le Fay.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Oh, well, I will definitely keep my ears open for that.
Yeah, she's another, one of those characters. I mean, I know that you weren't, that interested in Joan of Arc initially, but she's another one of those characters where you say her name and people are like, ooh.
Oh, I think she's fascinating. I would love to read your take on her.
Yeah, she's just a very elusive character. So yes. I tend to think of, I have a long line of people I want to write about, and I have this image in my head of like, those like offices that you rent?
Mm-hmm.
And they're like really like shabby offices. It's just like a desk and a lamp and a chair, and it's like really cheap, probably in like a pretty bad neighborhood. And I picture like the number of characters I want to write about as creating like this kind of queue outside the door, and they have to take their turn coming into this shabby office so that I can write about them. And so right now it's just me and Morgan in the room, and I'm looking at her and she's like kind of avoiding me, and we're trying to like, face each other down. So it's kind of like that kind of situation. And then the other people who are standing outside the office are sort of tapping on the window and saying, when is it my turn to be written about? So
I love that.
So that's how I picture this.
That's such a great visual. I'm imagining you like in this dingy, smoke-filled room.
Yes.
Like film noir music playing.
Yeah. Right, except I don't smoke. I'm too poor to afford cigarettes. But yeah, but there should be smoke, and there's the smell of tobacco in the air, and Morgan is sort of like just flitting around the room and not looking at me and casting like scornful glances at me over her shoulder. Yeah. So that's how it is right now.
I love it. And I know you don't have much of or any social media presence. Is there a way that people can keep up to date with what you're doing?
I don't think so, actually. Isn't that a terrible answer? I don't think so. So, I mean, the only way that I guess people can find me is through these interviews, or through this interview that I'm doing with you.
Well, then I'm very happy to help, and I'll keep my ears open so that when your next book does come out, we can do another one of these.
Oh, yeah, that would be great. I would love to I'll speak with you again, Jennifer. This was awesome.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me on your show. Thanks.
Thank you again to Katherine J. Chen for such a compelling conversation and convincing me to love Joan. Join me this Sunday, November 13th, for the next edition of the Storytime Book Club, where we'll be meeting with author Kate Reardon from episode 36 of this podcast to talk about her book, The Heat Wave. Please visit Facebook for more information, and I'll see you back here next week with a very special guest. Join our book club. The Storytime Book Club welcomes authors who have been featured on this podcast to come talk more in depth about their books. Since we keep the podcast spoiler-free, this is the perfect chance to get all your specific questions answered. Our next guest will be season premiere guest Kate Reardon, discussing her book, The Heat Wave. For more information, including sign-up, please join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. You can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JENNYPHORIA. Thank you for listening, and until next time, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.